I hope the music conveyed the appropriate sense of drama for the session on America's global leadership role. First of all, thank you to the Doha Forum for partnering, allowing the McCain Institute for International Leadership, from which I come, to partner with Doha Forum in bringing this particular panel to the audience this afternoon, and we look forward to your participation. I say that because in some ways having Americans on stage talking to each other about Americans doesn't make a lot of sense when we have such a diverse and interesting global audience. So we will certainly leave time for questions and engagement with the audience at the end. The fact of an American role in providing global leadership is something that many of us grew up with taking for granted. It was very much a part of the landscape. Today, that global leadership, however, that role is not a given. It's certainly not a given in the same way that it has been for most of recent decades. To help us understand this phenomenon, we've got a terrific panel of my fellow Americans to help us unpack some of these difficult issues. I'll start immediately to my left with Governor Bill Richardson, one of our most distinguished public servants across a tremendous career that involved service in Congress, service as a cabinet minister, and service as a governor in his home state of New Mexico. Tom Bossert, senior advisor to both Presidents Bush and President Trump, and the most recent occupant of a senior position on this stage, certainly. And then on the far end, my friend and colleague Amy Pope, a senior advisor to President Obama during the second Obama administration at the White House, working on homeland security issues as well as other global issues of concern, including pandemics and global health. So I thought I would start the conversation by asking each of our panelists to respond to a question that we talked a little bit about in preparing for this session, and that is President Trump's avowed approach to an America First foreign policy and approach to global issues. Is that kind of America First approach, at least the labeling of an approach as America First, compatible with the leadership role that the United States has traditionally played in dealing with global issues and tackling global challenges and global security challenges? And I'll start with you, Governor Richardson, and then move down the line.
All right, thank you, Nick, especially for that overly generous introduction. I will start making 3 points. One, today the Madrid conference on climate change ended. Disappointingly, a weak compromise, because I believe partly because of an absence of American leadership. Secondly, the United States and Qatar have had a very strong relationship in the past. The presence yesterday, high-level delegation of the president's daughter, Senator Graham, who I believe gave a delusional talk on the state of U.S. politics, and several other important administration representatives, the Secretary of the Treasury, indicated to me that perhaps an admission was being made that the mistake of isolating a traditional ally like Qatar recently showed that the United States was trying to recover a little bit from that mistake. So I was very pleased with a high-level delegation, although I'm not sure about the messages. The third point I want to make is I'm an old-school politician, diplomat. It's hard for me to criticize a president when I'm overseas. And I'm going to say that I consider President Trump my president, although I'm going to try as much as I can as a Democrat to defeat him. I tried before, didn't work. So at the same time, those are 3 caveats. My point is that, Nick, I don't think every president says they're for America. But I think in this way that President Trump, shunning alliances, NATO, very fractured right now, getting out of the Paris Agreement, the second day getting out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, having fights with our traditional allies at the same time that, you know, we seem to be very comfortable dealing with Kim Jong-un, with President Putin. I'm realistic. I think you have to deal with all America's friends and adversaries. But my view is that this is not the typical American leadership in foreign policy, and it's evidenced most strongly in what happened in the climate agreement today, where science and most every nation embraces the concept of the dangers of carbon emissions, man-made, human-made, and so this conference ends up in a disappointment because of an absence of American leadership. Is that too long?
No, that's
Okay.
that's a great
Well, I'm done.
entry point. Tom,
I'm done.
Tom, with your service in President Trump's White House, you've often had to navigate between rhetoric and concrete policy objectives. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the role that you saw President Trump trying to play with America's global leadership on the set of issues that you were most involved with.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thank you for this invitation. I think maybe I'm going to change my answer that I had planned in advance, and I'm going to respond to the governor, who I respect quite a bit and have worked with, or at least worked on the same issues with, a number of times. So is that better? There you go. Okay, I don't agree with anything, but save one issue that the governor just laid out, and here's why. I don't believe it reflects an understanding of what I think President Trump is trying to achieve, and I don't mean that as a reflexive defense of him and his rhetoric or of his policies. This is not a domestic argument playing out on stage before you. I'm not trying to defend him. I honestly believe he has a more pragmatic and economically bent view of the world as opposed to a diplomatic and militarily bent view of the world. And in terms of pragmatism, it'll be my theme, my one theme today. It sometimes runs up against the values-based, rules-based system that we've come accustomed to, but I think it's a little bit consistent and a little bit unsettling at the same time. I'll give an example. I can't forecast this. I won't foreshadow it as an outcome, but the governor just referenced our relationship with China, and he referenced climate change. And so let me see if I can answer that a little bit differently. We withdrew from the Paris Accord, controversial. The Paris Accord gave China a 30-year pass on its reform needs, and its reforms are necessary as a matter, and I'm by no means an expert here, but its reforms are more necessary than 10 other countries combined, even if you cherry pick those 10 in terms of their emissions. If the trade tariffs that President Trump imposed on China are meant to change their behavior, not just on fair trade, not just on cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property and forced technology transfer and so forth, but also on their fundamental manufacturing efforts, their wanton disregard in many instances for the environment, then I would argue that it is a more pragmatic and effective and shorter-term tool to change the behavior of other countries that see no reason to change their behavior if they're being rewarded with positive economic gains. And so what we saw here, as I understand it, in phase one was an agreement to reach some normalized trade agreement and to pull back from the upcoming deadline on increased escalation. But I think phase two will address those behaviors that can be manipulated, changed, or modified with this blunt force tool. And it's uncommon, it's unusual, it's not a military threat, it's an economic threat, it makes others uncomfortable, but I think it defines this presidency as a pragmatic one. It just leaves the international community a little bit uncertain because they're not entirely sure on any given day or any given moment what his practical motivation might be and what his acceptable return or definition of success will be. So that's my premise, Nick. That's an example. But I respect the governor's view and his experience on the international stage, and so I alluded earlier to a place where I agreed with you, so as to not just disagree. And that is the high-level delegation's message, and that message was that the United States has increasingly embraced the GCC, the importance of all its members. I believe, I no longer speak for it, but the Qatari inclusion in a long-standing and positive relationship and cooperating relationship in this area is important. And I think I've said publicly in the last 2 days that I anticipate a positive outcome in a short term, and I think the Emir here has a lot of opportunity to capitalize on what seems to be an openness among the rest of the GCC to a return to normalized relations.
So I suspect we'll want to come back to this question of whether there is a kind of method or an underlying philosophy that guides what can often seem like a series of disjointed or uncoordinated actions. But before jumping into that, Amy, again, having served in one White House, having observed others, can you reflect your own sense of what one can expect out of a global leadership role with an avowed approach that says, make America great, or keep America first?
So interestingly, my role at the National Security Council was as the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, which meant that my primary responsibility was to make sure that the homeland, sort of the territorial body of the United States, was safe from a whole host of threats. So we were looking at terrorism, infectious disease, we were looking at cyber threats, we were looking at hurricanes and wildfires, a whole range of issues. And what I learned in that position was that there is effectively no threat where the United States is able to tackle it and mitigate the dangers of it alone. So take, for example, Ebola. We actually didn't think we had a problem with Ebola in the United States. We were quite confident that we had the infectious disease control practices in place that we needed to protect the United States and its citizens from Ebola. And it was to our very, very great surprise that in 2014, a Liberian national came into the United States and was not only treated at an American hospital where we thought we had the very best practices, but then infected 2 American nurses. And all of a sudden, we went on high alert. And at that point, it was put to the president that he should close down our borders. We should make sure that no other nationals from West Africa should come into the United States. And there was a real debate that happened in the Situation Room at that moment in time, and people were quite divided, and the public was quite divided. Ultimately, President Obama made the decision that there was no way that we could keep America safe if we closed our borders. Because ultimately, when you're talking about a disease like Ebola, you cannot contain it. And worse yet, you push the threat underground, and you cause people to use unauthorized channels of migration. And you increase the likelihood of the spread of the disease in West Africa, which increases the likelihood of the spread of the disease throughout the world. So that, I give you that example because to me it really captures what it means to put America first. It means that you take a long-term view on what are the most significant challenges of the 21st century. And in my mind, in my experience, those challenges are transnational. And unless we're working with our partners, unless we're working with our allies, unless we have open channels of communication and cooperation, America cannot be first. So ultimately, I think a policy that does not value those relationships fails.
Well, Amy, you took us into a very specific issue that is obviously an exemplar of something you observed more broadly. And let's maybe dive into a little bit to some specific issues for a minute. I would ask each of our panelists to respond to the question of where is the presence or absence of a robust or traditional U.S. leadership role felt more acutely? Is it on the kind of transnational issues that Amy alluded to, or is it on some of the really difficult regional issues that have been the subject of conversation here at the Doha Forum this week, whether that's Syria, whether that's North Korea, whether that's Iranian pursuit of a nuclear program? Where is that sense of American leadership or its absence most acutely felt? And I would ask maybe to start with you, Tom, and then come back to the governor.
Well, I have a number of answers here. I mean, you know, look, diseases travel without visas. I was famous for saying that, but I really stole it from the former head of the CDC. But listen, it would have been a bad decision to do that. I actually reject a lot of the framing here, right? So even of the fundamental forum, which I think is a very important forum, I don't believe we're in a multipolar world. I think we're heading increasingly into this bipolar world. I fear it anyway. It doesn't mean that multilateralism isn't important. It just means that I think the U.S. administration right now is recognizing a set of priorities. It doesn't mean that we devalue any one issue. The whole world is moving into a little bit of a focus on, you know, major power conflict and away from, unwisely, away from the counterterrorism threat. You don't want to move too far away. You know, the notion of the Pacific pivot was taken poorly because it made this region feel as if we were leaving it entirely for the Asian conflict and Asian problems. We're now Indo-Pacific, I guess. But again, that wasn't President Obama's intent, in my view. So it was an unfair characterization. I think he just simply meant that we have to provide more effort, more time, and more priority to a growing problem in the Indo-Pacific. And so the framing here, Nick, is where are we not doing enough? I think this is the fundamental question President Trump is putting to this world. Where are we not doing enough? It can't be where is the United States not doing enough. We will run out of money, and we will run out of skill, and we will run out of capacity to handle each problem around the world if we don't have a strong invested partner in each parts of those worlds. So listen, let me give counterterrorism, because that was my place. Nick and I, we served on this. Admiral McCraven put forward the notion that success in our counterterrorism, our so-called global war on terror, would be the day that we get our partner nation states to a level of willingness and capacity that they could handle the problem themselves. We would never defeat the ideology completely, but each nation that we were partnered with at the time would eventually become capable of handling their own internal security matters. And if that's the case, I think we're going to end up with this traditional tension between multilateralism, international law, and sovereignty. And I think what you're seeing is President Trump trying to encourage an expeditious, end to this war by having each country take their own responsibility. And he's a little bit more worried about the ends and a little bit less worried about the means than traditional U.S. presidents. If a nation decides in its own sovereign interest to do something that might be considered heinous or brutal by the Western world, it's wise to object or to raise concern, but not necessarily ruin the relationship with that nation if what they're doing is achieving a larger strategic end. And so I've kind of gone all over the map there, but in terms of what we do, why we do it, and why he's more of a pragmatic president, I think it would reform our premise and our basis for asking these questions if we realized that he's trying to prioritize the Indo-Pacific and he's trying to encourage nations in this region to take a greater investment in their own security outcome.
Governor.
Well, I hate to disagree with Tom because he's such a nice guy. And he's complimented me many times. But you notice, this is what happens when, you get old. People say nice things about you and disagreeing. The biggest setback, policy reverse negative, has been our recent decision in Syria, where we abdicated our responsibility by moving our presence out, the troops out, abandoning the Kurds, and also giving a foothold to Russia, to Assad, a major strategic mistake that I think has been criticized by both parties, by Republicans and Democrats. Secondly, you asked, Nick, what is the one area that you think the biggest abdication has been? I'm a multilateralist. I was American ambassador to the UN. I think the UN is a very valuable international tool that involves all nations. I think our funding problems with the UN, in other words, funding it at very low levels, our efforts at not concentrating on many of the issues that Amy mentioned, endemic diseases, the rights of women, many other important elements of multilateral approaches, getting out of the World Trade Organization, or basically saying the World Trade Organization is weak, its mechanism for settling disputes, we don't believe in it, we want to get out of it. That is very troublesome in terms of our responsibility as a leader in a multilateral world. And finally, I will talk a little bit about Africa, Latin America. It seems that a lot of our policy is based on maximum pressure with an absence of diplomacy. I will cite Venezuela. I will cite Iran, although I think Iran, in many cases, its support for negative elements. I wouldn't have gotten out of the nuclear agreement, although I had some concerns about Iran's activities in the region. I think this multiple maximum pressure campaign in some cases, in many cases, has not worked. I will conclude with a little bit of a disagreement with Tom. I never criticized our policy on China. In fact, I think that China, because of its activities with intellectual property, negative transfer of technology, needed a jolt, needed some strong measures in terms of negotiating. I just don't think putting tariffs indiscriminately across the board, as we've done, to negotiate an agreement has been in the best interests of the international community, the global economic system. And so I will conclude with North Korea. I think that the president, I publicly stated when he reached out to North Korea, that was the right decision. Nobody had talked to Kim Jong-un. But I think our policy is right now in very deep trouble because we've given the North Koreans the only way we are going to negotiate is through the president. We've given them 3 summits, not preparing adequately in terms of denuclearization, what that means. What does it mean lessening sanctions? Now we've got a situation where the North Koreans are not even talking to us. That's not good. With Iran, I don't think the Iranians are talking to us. We completed a prisoner exchange initiative, which we were involved in, my foundation. But is there any result? Is there any positive movement in terms of diplomacy with Iran? We've reached out to them. They're rejecting us. I think there has to be something that's fundamental to the Doha conference. Diplomacy. You got to talk to people. You got to negotiate. You can't just beat them up.
Amy?
So I want to tease apart this difference between regional versus functional, which was, even within the bureaucracy that is the U.S. government, sometimes came in tension with each other. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. So one of the issues that I dealt with quite often was migration. As many of you know, there's been pretty significant migration from Central America to the U.S. borders. But it's wrong to think about that issue just in terms of the migration of people from one part of the world to another. The right answer is to take a look at what's been happening in the region for some time and to identify the impact of not only the civil wars and conflict in Central America on their stability, on their governments, on opportunities, et cetera, for their people, but also to identify what causes those people to migrate in the first place, right? So you can't just take it in isolation. We can't take terrorism in isolation. We can't take cybercrime in isolation. We have to think about what's happening within the region. We have to think about what the opportunities are for the people in those regions. We need to come up with more holistic strategies for handling those. But I do want to take on one of the issues that you raised early on, which is President Trump merely acting on behalf of American interests rather than sort of looking at things more holistically? I mean, what I see, in some ways, there's commonality between President Trump and President Obama, and that they both believed that it was no longer appropriate for the United States to lead in response to every single challenge. They both believed there was significant room for partners to step up and help respond to various challenges. That's similar. But where I see a difference is sort of this, what causes us to lead? And what's really missing with this president, and I think this is specific to President Trump, because we didn't see this with President Bush or President Clinton or President Obama, is this notion of values-based leadership. And I think that is a key difference, because if we're looking at another 4 years of a Trump administration, what does that mean for American leadership around the world? Are we values-based or are we transactional?
That actually takes us into a nice pivot, which was, look, it's no secret that the United States is entering an election year, and that by this time next year we will be on the cusp of another inauguration, either a re-elected President Trump or a brand new president. And so all of the things that we've been talking around and about in this conversation could look very different, or we'd be on a trajectory that could take us 4 more years into the future. So I'd maybe ask Governor Richardson, then Tom, then Amy to reflect on that, and then we'll look to maybe open up to some audience questions as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to be, I don't think very bold, but here's my view. And by the way, one of the things that Tom that Nick did not mention is I was in a presidential election. I didn't do too well. I ran against Obama. That was not a smart move. But I ran around the country. I know a little. Here's my prediction. I don't think there's any way President Trump can be reelected. I don't think so. I don't think he can win. He can get reelected. Why am I saying that? Even after several conversations here with many individuals at the Doha Forum, that I even heard somebody say that they think impeachment is going to help the president. I really don't see how that's going to happen. I believe that the country, Nick, will reverse to the more internationalist foreign policy that Republicans and Democrats have had. I mean, I was an envoy to North Korea for President Bush, and I know, Tom, that's the kind of Republican Party that I always admired, internationalist, bipartisan. We don't have that. The man you worked for, John McCain, internationalist, bipartisan. I think America's going to revert to that. On the election, you know, you can talk about New Mexico, you can talk about many other states. We have 50 states. The election is going to be decided in 4 states: Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Florida, I think the Republicans are probably going to win that, so I'll take that away. The rest of the states, we can all know who's going to win. And I think in those 5 states, 4 states that I mentioned, the president's in deep trouble. I mean, he's not polling well. Now, we've got a year to go. We don't have a Democratic candidate. I think my party is drifting a little too much to the left, but at the same time, I think a candidate will emerge, a ticket will emerge after primaries. I hear from people, oh, you have 20 candidates, you know, they're all too left. Well, wait till the primaries are over, and then we have a general election. I do believe that America is very ripe for a change because some of the issues that Amy mentioned, the immigration issue, the issue of inclusion, the issue of diversity. I see this room full of diversity. I think that's America. That's the America we've become. And I think you're going to see those voters, those minority voters, those suburban voters come out very strongly. And I don't see a good outcome for the president. Now, I know Tom's going to disagree very nicely, but that's my thought.
Well, we didn't exactly ask for election prognostication, but you would expect that from a politician, someone who knows the political scene as well as the governor does. Tom, I won't make you pick a winner in the next election unless you choose that you want to. But more importantly, maybe, how do you see the next 4 years playing out? Just imagine a trajectory that more or less continues the kind of approach to global leadership that you outlined. I think.
Yeah. Again, I don't do domestic politics. I have no idea. I've heard predictions before. I don't know who to listen to. But I guess the question is, there's a perception that President Trump's doing something different, and the question is, will that end shortly? Can people make this calculated decision to wait that out, or will there be a longer duration of the kind of Trump doctrine, so to speak, if there is one? I'm branding that doctrine as pragmatism. I don't think there's any other ism that applies to Trump. I think there's a whole lot that he does, but leverage is key. And the place where you're right, I will disagree with you, Governor, is the notion that diplomacy works without leverage. It doesn't. And so it's very nice. It's very important. I don't think President Trump has left it behind. I think his rhetoric at times is unnecessarily confrontational in public. But that's not much different than the confrontational rhetoric I saw in private with some of our traditional Western European allies, for example, in previous Republican administrations. I think there are places where we disagree, and I think there are contributions that needed to be readjusted, and I think he took it on in ways that others didn't care for. I understand that. But without that leverage and without that practical prioritization that I spoke to earlier, I don't think President Trump would really exist. I think he took that approach to his campaign, is my sense, but he's certainly taking it to international order. I do agree that there needs to be a place, an avenue for redress for any international grievance. That's key to maintaining stability and peace in the world. And so the tearing down of any international institution by itself is a bad premise, is a bad idea. If it's not behaving fairly or appropriately or fast enough, then that's something we should discuss. But tearing it down altogether is something I don't abide. and again, I don't want to pick on all the other issues and make this a fight or a debate, but again, I think it's something worth presenting to this community and to this audience that I don't think President Trump is behaving in a way that is so radically, that is such a radical departure from previous U.S. behaviors. He's simply taking a particularly pragmatic view towards leverage. Where can he achieve and how can he use the tools available to him to achieve certain outcomes? I don't share a very positive or rosy view in North Korea. I think in Syria it could have been handled better and more carefully. On the other hand, there was always going to be, in fairness to President Trump, a political reckoning with the decision taken to arm the SDF. And there was almost a guaranteed Russian influence the day that the previous administration asked the Russians into Syria to remove chemical weapons. And so I just reject a lot of these examples used to verify or validate the claim that he's behaving in an irrational way on the international stage. I could be biased, but I think those two things are pretty well established by the same bipartisan critics of the decision on how he handled the withdrawal from Syria. But most people recognize the reckoning was coming on that decision. Maybe a last point here, Nick, to tie that together. Regardless of the political outcome, I think, what you're seeing in the United States, we just saw play out in Great Britain, and we've seen play out elsewhere. I think, the Scottish party, National Party, also called for some independence. I think you're seeing this not move towards nationalism, but a rejection of international rules and laws and bodies that feel as if they're distant. People are trying to take back some local control, and I'm not entirely sure how and why that plays out, but I think that you're seeing in the United States a choice bigger than the personalities and policies being presented, and I think we just saw that in Great Britain. People are seeming to reject things that build resentment in terms of distant rule. The European Union, not that distant, but perhaps more distant from the UK than its voters wanted, and then drawing some distance in accountability. There's a resentment, I think, that started Brexit over, kind of the pigs, right? The Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and the need to bail them out. So be careful to not miss the big, I think, the big trend lines. When you look at domestic politics and you look at states in that analysis, I think there are voters around the world that are looking to move into a more sovereign, self-governing, self-gratifying kind of governance system, and that's actually a bit of a danger. That does threaten our multilateral order, and that does bear this whole group paying closer attention.
That is something important to think about. Amy, why don't we give you the last word before we turn to the audience?
Sure. First, I'm a little bit more hesitant to take the British example as predictive of where things are at this moment in time, partly because I think that was as much a reflection of the frustration with the ability of the parliament to get things done, and on some level, people just wanted the government to focus. And so I'm a little bit, I'd be afraid of saying, well, that's actually that people really, really wanted Brexit in some particular shape or form. But that said, I think the real danger of another 4 years of President Trump in office is really this threat to multilateralism. It is a threat to the credibility of institutions like the United Nations, of NATO, of a whole host of institutions that we've grown to rely on since World War II. And for those of you who listened to Alistair Burt's talk in the plenary session, he reflected that this was what we see right now appears to be people forgetting why we needed those institutions in the first place. And that is what I feel like is animating a lot of the politics of this moment, and a lesson that President Trump has not necessarily internalized. But that said, I think there is something to what Thomas just said that all of us who care about multilateralism need to take to heart, which is the fact that these institutions aren't necessarily fit for purpose. When we look for the most difficult challenges at this moment in time, they are not always able to give us solutions that are meaningful. that are flexible, that are agile, and there is frustration within the international community about the ability of these institutions to do what we need them to do. So I'm an optimist by nature, which means that I look for opportunities to turn lemons into lemonade. And what I see is that President Trump has actually created an opportunity to question whether these institutions are doing what they need to do and to reform them. And for those of us who care about the future of a multilateral world, I think we need to take that to heart and to look for ways to reform.
So with that, why don't we turn to the audience for some questions? First hand I saw was in the back there.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. My name is Bill Clifford. I'm with the World Affairs Councils of America in Washington, D.C. My question is for Mr. Bossert. The national security strategy that was issued under the President's signature in December 2017 identified China and Russia as two principal challengers to U.S. power, influence, and interests, that they would erode our security and prosperity, that they would weaken our economies, that they would control data and information to repress their societies and expand their influence abroad. So I want to understand how, in practice, President Trump's handling, or the way he chums up to, if you could say, President Putin is not a radical departure, and how is U.S.-Russia policy under this administration pragmatic?
Okay, so there was a China component to that, but a Russia punchline. And so just briefly on China, I think the kind of takeaway for me is that the premise I've heard in most of the sessions as we talk about China at this session, at this forum, have placed this I think, burden of proof in the wrong place. They've suggested it's the United States that's asking the rest of the world to choose between it and China, to essentially make this hard divorce decision. And I actually reject that. And I think it's the Chinese that have been asking that of its client states and of its large consumers and large economic partners. And it's the United States that's finally saying that we've had enough of that, and we would strongly recommend most countries to re-examine their thinking on that. It's going to be very difficult. It's not for me to ever enter any country and say don't do business with another foreign business or another foreign country. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I believe that the world will wake up in 40 years and they'll be surprised by the Trojan horse of Chinese economic entanglement and what it will yield. And they won't be happy with what it yields because it's them that is refusing to change their kind of state-driven, state-manipulated capitalism, as they call it. I'm not saying that you should choose the U.S. version. I'm suggesting the U.S. version is agnostic to your political governing system. A capitalist free trade market doesn't speak to your political organizational structure. And so I think it's a nicer and better and freer way for us all to get along internationally to trade without those political constraints. On your question with Russia, I think President Trump's words and his actions on Russia are incongruent. And that's not meant as a criticism, but I think he's maintained quite a bit of, I think, distance to say the least, when given an opportunity to criticize Russia and its behaviors. But when it comes to using those elements or tools of national power, I haven't seen an instance where he hasn't used them. We continued the Obama-era sanctions and doubled down on them, really, against the oligarchs for their hacking of the 2016 election cycle. Despite the president's rhetoric, he also approved that. And there's a number of other examples that follow. So I think his actions are quietly painful to the Russians. I think his words are publicly praiseworthy. I'm not sure if he thinks that's the right tactic or if that'll yield a good outcome, but that's my assessment of his behavior.
Hi, I'm Leah West. I'm a professor in Ottawa. So I guess it's for anyone who wants to answer.
Could you hold the mic closer?
Yes. So I think actions and inactions based on values-based leadership, one could argue, has led to some of actions that have led to major losses in U.S. credibility. If you want to think about the invasion of Iraq, the statement about the red line in Syria, and then subsequent inaction. And I'm just wondering if, as an outsider, we sometimes see the values of the U.S. being manipulated to advance what might be best described as U.S. interests in a region. rather than a values-based action. So wouldn't maybe a transparently transactional U.S. foreign policy at least provide the international community with some sense of predictability and thereby create some stability rather than cloaking what is seemingly transactional with this values-based rhetoric?
I'd love for Governor Richardson to answer that, but I'd start with how predictable is U.S. foreign policy at this moment in time? And I'm asking that, right, because I don't think that's what we have. That's right.
Governor, anything you want to talk? I mean, you've served in Democratic administrations which had a very avowedly strong concern for human rights, for promotion of democracy abroad, and I think the question gets to the point of whether some of that took us in the direction of foreign policy decisions that ended up being, if not net losses, certainly more complicated and at some cost to U.S. credibility around the world. So from your perspective, do you see a values-based foreign policy as opposed to the more transactional approach that Tom described, the Trump doctrine, if there is such a thing? How do you rack and stack those two approaches?
Well, my concern is that all administrations in the past, in my judgment, have valued human rights issues as a cornerstone of our foreign policy. I'm not sure that's the case in this administration. There seems to be an affinity for Putin, for Duterte in the Philippines, for Kim Jong-un, in the absence of our traditional human rights relationships within the United Nations. I see that we have these fights NATO-wise with Germany, with Great Britain, with France, over traditional, not just economic and alliance issues, but on human rights issues. And that troubles me because I think human rights is critically important as a cornerstone of not just our multilateral, but our bilateral policy. You know, I worry about that we don't do enough on human rights with China. I worry that we don't do enough human rights in the Human Rights Council at the UN. With North Korea, we did not participate in the human rights examination of North Korea last week at the UN. So I'm troubled by that. And I try to find some things, at least for this audience, that I can say positive. And I'll conclude, I think and I apologize for like getting into an election prediction. I thought that's what you would ask me.
Pleased to have it.
But I think the power centers that are going to emerge, regardless of who's president, one is the United States. That's one power center. The second, I would combine Russia and China as a second power center. The third would be the European Union, still as a power. Fourth would be what you mentioned, transactional groups like cartels, like terrorism groups, like ISIS, that you can't define and find, but are out there.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Microphone.
You all hear me? Okay. My name's Jeffrey Hayden. I'm a student at the University of Florida studying history, international relations, Arabic. So while I have this platform, go Gators. Second, I do apologize if this question is unsimple-minded, but all of you have talked in some way, shape, or form about U.S. reliance now on partners, withdrawal in some way, shape, or form from Governor Richardson and Mr. Bossert. You both talked about withdrawal from armed conflicts. Governor Richardson, you specifically talked about Syria. And this morning, the discussion about Afghanistan, to me, when I think of that, I immediately go to Vietnam, which is a cliche comparison, I know, but is something that is deep to me, considering my neighbor and my uncle both served in Vietnam. So when I think of the comparison and how the situation currently is in Afghanistan, what makes the current administration so confident that what occurred in Vietnam between 1973 and 1975 can be avoided in Afghanistan? There are multiple comparisons in terms of, negotiations with an enemy we have been long engaged with, and now we are leaving what makes the administration comfortable with leaving. What do you think? Is that so? And if we are wrong, what is the domino effect of that on our leadership and our credibility with the international community? Thank you.
Tom, you want to take a crack at that?
You want me to start? Well, Afghanistan's the thrust of that question, but thank you, and thanks for introducing yourself there as well. I'm glad when students ask questions, it's not simple-minded at all. It's actually pretty profound. Okay, so on Afghanistan, maybe I'll take it as where it is as opposed to where it was and how it started. I have some degree of optimism. It comes from some recent behaviors I'm watching from the outside. I have no internal or private knowledge here, but it seems like the willingness to start to trade some hostages. It seems like the willingness to announce open talks, maybe even conclude them in that kind of failed Camp David bid. All speak towards some potential chilling here. I think there's an opportunity, but again, I think this is an opportunity for me to kind of reinforce what I believe is a larger view held by this current president. He is absolutely eager to stop any military engagement. And the fact that he stayed in Afghanistan is one example to Governor Richardson's worry that he does have a concern over humanitarian issues. The other might be the fact that he enforced that red line in Syria. I think him watching the use of those prohibited chemical weapons was something that drove him to use force. I know the international community was concerned that he didn't use force after the Abqaiq bombing, but that's a multilateral, I think, example for the positive. I think a lot of partners in the region didn't want him to, and so he consulted them. So on Afghanistan, a bold prediction. I think that we're going to see some ceasefire, not peace agreement, at the end of this winter. It'll be the very end of this winter, call it spring, and that'll be maybe the first time we've seen such a thing that might have legs and might survive for an entire fighting season in the last 18 or 19 years. And I believe it's because Pakistan has felt differently under this administration, that leverage question we talked about. And I believe it's because there's been some positive reform efforts by Ghani that we haven't seen in years past. That's, I think, partly U.S.-led, but also, I think, a sign of fatigue.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the microphone to say a few words about Afghanistan as well, because much of this conversation has focused on differences between an Obama approach to global leadership and a Trump approach to global leadership. But having sat through a part of those conversations in both administrations, what's striking to me is the degree of continuity and the concern that each president brought to the sense of what does it mean to succeed in the mission in Afghanistan, and have we appropriately matched resources to mission, and is the mission that we are defining for ourselves achievable? President Obama asked that question. President Trump asked that question. They asked it in very different ways, given their very different styles that we have talked about. But I think in many ways, it was, in a sense, reassuring to me that this administration was grappling with those issues in the same difficult, hard way that the Obama administration was. It doesn't mean that the outcomes are any easier or that the risks that you identify are not there. And I think that is something that this administration will have to calibrate, is what degree of risk they would be accepting with, by entering into agreements with the Taliban. But again, it's something that's often missed in comparing two administrations, that there's actually some commonality to. It seems we have time for one last question, and so I'll ask.
My question is directed to Mr. Tom Sperset. Details emerged from the U.S. first stage deal with China, which marked a milestone in the President Trump initiative to rebalance trade. Okay, with Beijing, but left questions over how far it goes to level the playing fields for the U.S. businesses.
What was the question on China trade policy?
Yeah, details emerged from the U.S. first stage deal with China, which marked a milestone in President Trump initiative to rebalance trade with Beijing, but left questions over how far it goes to level the playing field and the U.S. businesses.
Yeah, so the question is the change behaviors and reforms that the U.S. sought, did China concede? And over what timetable and what enforcement mechanisms will be there? I think you've asked the best question you could ask on that topic, but no one knows the answer yet. I think what we've seen is that there was an agreement to normalize, to stave off additional escalatory trade tariffs, and to essentially buy a lot more stuff. from the Chinese perspective, buying more U.S. agricultural goods and other things. You have to hope that that means there's been some thawing or progress towards changing their internal behaviors, those that we consider out of line with fair trade practices. But I think the answer is that's been pushed until the second round of negotiations under some sign of good faith and agreement in principle. That's all I know. I think that's all the rest of the world knows. And I know there was seemingly a breakthrough on some of the cyber and some of the forced technology transfer, at least at a principle level, issues, and that allowed this to take place. So beyond that, I have no more to say. I think phase 2 should play out over the next 6 months.
So I'm getting the sign that we should wrap this session up. I think it's fair to say that when Doha Forum 2020 meets, this set of issues will be very much on the agenda, whether we're dealing with a re-elected President Trump or a new American president. So thank you again for your participation in this session.